Today we are studying Matthew chapter 8, 14 through 17. A little bit of quick background. Sometimes, we forget that the disciples were real people with families, loved ones and friends, and live life with all the frustration and challenges. So Jesus heals a leper, a Gentile, and then a woman. All three of these were outsiders, people on the margins of society who were excluded from full participation in the life and worship of the community. And Jesus reaches out to all these three. Jesus healing all the people who came to him in the evening with all sorts of diseases is more impressive than Jesus healing this one person from a fever. But that is exactly the point here. Jesus had compassion for the crowds, but Jesus never lost sight of one individual. What does Peter's mother-in-law have to do with the previous, two miracles? What is the point of telling us that she was healed? Well, in this account, she was healed without saying a word, without asking for anything. Peter was a married man. At a later period, his wife accompanied him on his journeys, according to 1 Corinthians 9:5. Clement of Alexandria tells us that Peter and his wife were martyred together. Peter, so the story goes, saw his wife suffer before he suffered himself, hanged upside down on a cross, because Peter said he was not worthy to die in the same manner of Jesus. That's according to William Barclay, the Gospel of Matthew. And so here we see that, according to St. Clement of Alexandria, they say that the blessed Peter, seeing his own wife led away to death, rejoiced because of her calling and her return home, and called to her with a loud voice, addressing her by name and saying, "Remember the Lord." Now here on the top right screen, according to Hengel, Fortress Press 1977, the crucifixion, Roman law allowed Roman citizens to be crucified. But notice here with the yellow, women were subject to crucifixion just as were the men. That's according to Josephus, the Jewish historian. In fact, women had fewer rights and far less respect than men in the Roman Empire. So it would have been more likely rather than less likely that they would have been subjected to cruel punishment. Now here's a good question. If Peter was the first pope of Rome, well, he had a wife. So why don't popes marry if their leader had a wife? And so Peter, according to 1 Corinthians 9:5, says here, don't we have the right to take a believing wife along with us, as do the other apostles and the Lord's brothers and Peter, or Cephas. Cephas is the Aramaic word for Peter. So there we have biblical evidence that he did have a wife. And so in the regions where the Jordan River entered and left the Sea of Galilee, there were marshy grounds. There the malaria mosquitoes bred and flourished, and both Capernaum and Tiberias were areas where malaria was very prevalent. It was often accompanied by jaundice and fever, and was the most miserable experience, obviously, for the sufferer. It was most likely malaria from which Peter's mother-in-law was suffering, again according to William Barclay. So fever was not understood as a symptom of an infection, but as the disease itself. In this instance, in the home of one of his disciples, there is no request for healing, no expression of faith. According to Walter Wilson, he notes that this is the only healing story in Matthew in which no dialogue occurs. Verse 14, when Jesus came into Peter's house, he saw Peter's mother-in-law lying in bed with fever. When the science of archaeology emerged in the 19th century, it was thought that it would disprove many issues of the Bible. But in reality, many of the historical facts of the Bible have been confirmed scientifically through archaeology. Now, one example of this comes from the city of Capernaum, where most scholars agree that the home of Simon Peter has been uncovered. During the 4th and 5th centuries, it was common for churches to be built over such holy places. Now, underneath a church built during that time period was found a house that dated back to around 100 BC. The excavators could tell that the house was remodeled sometime in the late 1st century AD. This remodeling probably indicates that it was converted from a private residence to a public meeting house. 134 fragments of plaster from the 2nd century had writings with the names of Peter and references to Jesus on them. The conclusion by archaeologists is that this was the home of Peter and was later converted into a church. If this is the case, it is the home where the miracle of the healing of Peter's mother-in-law occurred. This is the miracle to which we now turn and find in Matthew chapter 8, 14 through 17. So Jesus had come into Peter's house, and archaeological evidence points to the fact that the house was close to the local synagogue, as we can see here in this archaeological discovery, and just as Mark recorded it in Mark 1:29. Perhaps Peter's father had passed on, and Peter and Andrew, Peter's brother, took over the family home. Then Peter's mother-in-law moved in with them. If this were not so, the passage would say the house of the father of Simon. It was custom for the children to take over their parents' house or compound, when they pass on. Most extended families lived together. When a young couple got married, they moved into the husband's parents' home. Peter was very young, probably at this time, possibly recently married prior to encountering Jesus. Adult children were expected to care for their parents. Caring for the extended family was more common and essential than it is today in our modern world. Now, this was not just some mere headache. The text literally reads that she was thrown in bed with fever, and the Greek word thrown here is balo. It's throw or to drop. So this was an important story to the gospel writers. It's one of the few stories that is shared by Matthew, Mark, and Luke in their gospels. We tend to minimize the fever when we read this passage. We think of it as, well, it's just a headache. But a fever often meant serious illness in those days. The Gospel of Luke tells us that it was a high fever. And even today, a high fever can be dangerous. Verse 15, he touched her hand and the fever left her, and she got up and began to wait on him. So the healing occurs by means of touch, and the fever leaves her immediately. As usual, the different gospel writers emphasize different parts of what happened that day. For example, Luke tells us how Jesus rebuked the fever, or the Greek puretos. It literally means inflamed, fiery heat. But Matthew here emphasizes Jesus' physical touch. Now, the Greek word for touch is haptomai. It means to modify or change by touch. It's a beautiful detail, description, and confirmation of the healing, provided by the brief report that, she got up, hijero, and began to serve him. After the Lord healed her, we read in the King James Version that she ministered unto them. Now, almost all other translations say that she ministered unto him. So the Greek suggests that the proper thought is that she ministered unto Jesus and maybe possibly to them afterwards. In other words, she was able to resume her role in the home and the community. Peter's mother-in-law did not just get up, she was hijero, raised. It's the same term that is used in the Gospels for the resurrection of Jesus. Her healing came about through the same power that was active in Jesus' resurrection. So the term for serving occurs in Matthew in reference to the work of, angels who serve, discipleship, servers, and, even Jesus' ministry. First of all, Jesus' physical touch here prepares us for verse 17, which talks about Jesus carrying our diseases. We carry things with our hands. And so Matthew focuses on Jesus touching Peter's mother-in-law with his hands. But it also ties in with Matthew's focus on Jesus caring for the outsider. Now remember, these first three healing miracles are directed towards a leper, a Gentile, and now a woman. All three here are considered outsiders. But even though Peter's mother-in-law was Jewish, she was still a woman. It was taboo for a Jewish man to even touch a woman's hand. But Jesus keeps breaking down the walls that kept people out of the kingdom. This miracle also teaches us that Jesus saves so that we may serve. That's the whole purpose. Notice the order of what happens. She did not serve Christ first and then receive the healing. No, Jesus healed her first and then she served him. Anyone who has had fever is usually weak for some time after. But Peter's mother-in-law was immediately able to serve Jesus and possibly even the guests. By the way, this part of the healing miracle also went against the rabbi's taboo. The rabbis forbade women from serving men lest they become accustomed to being around men. And so this is a very meaningful miracle recorded by Matthew for us here. It may seem like a small miracle, but it teaches us these two very important truths, that Jesus cares for the individual and the outsider. Jesus saves so that we may serve. When Jesus touches us, we need to get up immediately and begin serving. When Jesus touches us with power, it is not to make us feel important, but for service. In verse 16, when evening came, many who were demon-possessed were brought to him, and he drove out the spirits with a word and healed all the sick. So the Greek word for brought here is phero, meaning to carry a burden or move by carrying. Since there were no ambulance services, many people literally carried the ill to Peter's home so Jesus could heal them. The verb is in the imperfect tense. It signifies a continuous action. And so a steady stream of sick and demon-possessed people were being carried to Jesus continuously. But then also, look what it led to. We go from Jesus healing the individual to Jesus healing many. So the other truth we learn from this verse is that there is a difference between illness and evil spirits. Notice that Matthew distinguishes those who are ill, that's very important, those who are ill from those who are demon possessed. He distinguishes physical suffering from spiritual suffering. There's a difference then between illness and evil spirits. Now we know from other scripture verses that demonic possession can sometimes present itself as illness. But we should not make the mistake of thinking that all illness is demonic in nature. If someone has a bad cold during a prayer meeting and someone put their hands on them and started casting out the demon behind the cold, one can appreciate the prayer and the concern, but sometimes a cold is just a cold. Sometimes a fever is just a fever. We shouldn't be looking for demons under every bush and approach every illness as demonic in origin. Verse 17. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. He took up our infirmities and bore our diseases. This Greek word asthenia, properly without strength. Strength is thenos, and you add the a, asthenia or asthenos means without strength. The other Greek word here is nosos. It's a chronic, persisting disease, and typically an incurable ailment. And so many of the so-called faith healers use this verse to teach that Christ, in his death, took our infirmities and bore our sickness and in his body when he died on the tree, thus giving us the power to rebuke and heal all sickness by faith. The problem is that this prophecy is not being applied to the atoning work of Christ on the cross. It is applied to his earthly ministry before his death on the cross. So Matthew demonstrated himself to be a skilled editor by omitting, certain details for the purpose of giving, a new perspective on the existing material. Matthew simplifies this story by not mentioning certain characters and information. The result of Matthew's short narrative is that the feverish woman and Jesus will be the focused individuals in this story for the purpose to include this Isaiah quote. So this shows us that the interpretation of Isaiah's prophecy was fulfilled by Jesus' healing ministry, in which he did take away, disabilities and carry away diseases. However, as noted earlier, Isaiah 53:4 is certainly speaking of the Lord's death to put away our sin. And what is the application? Jesus has authority over diseases and demons and fulfills prophecy. So ask in Jesus' holy name to be healed. Please subscribe. Please share. Thank you, and God bless you.